Hey guys, so in the last section we looked at Woolf's formulation of meaningfulness, where she literally says that meaning is created when we act out of reasons of love on a worthy object and engage with it in a positive way. And then she moved on to say that this involves some kind of subjective attraction to an objective attractiveness, and she suggests that this kind of attraction and interaction with the objectively attractive object is not a passive one. It can't be one that's done accidentally. It can't be one done without thought. There has to be an interaction with the object. So it's a kind of interactive relationship we have with the worthy object. So that's how she kind of talks about meaning. Meaning needs to meet that kind of criteria. And then she finishes off looking at two different ways that people commonly think about living a meaningful life. And the first one is following a passion, and the second one is being called to do something that is greater than yourself, or to get involved in something that is greater than yourself. Okay, this time we're going to look a little bit more about that subjective aspect of meaning, the way that she conceives of it, where we think about the fulfillment view. And the fulfillment view is, again, find your passion, follow that subjective yearning that you may have towards something, all right? So the fulfillment view is about basically fulfilling yourself by finding your passion. So we're going to explore how compatible the fulfillment view of living a good life is with Woolf's understanding of a meaningful life. That's our overall goal. We need to name, define, and interrelate key terms. We need to outline commonly held views about living a fulfilling life. So what does it actually mean? How do people conceive of it? And then we need to compare and contrast these commonly held views with Woolf's outline of a meaningfulness to see how adequate the fulfillment view is when explaining, or when allowing us or providing us with a framework to live a meaningful life. Not a fulfilling life, but a meaningful life, okay? So can you write these down, 1, 2, 3, and score yourself? And then after that, what I'd like you to do is to draw a picture of an activity that you believe could be fulfilling, but not meaningful. Can you actually think of one? It's a bit of a thought experiment. All right, so this section starts off with a little bit of a recap. She goes again and considers the two different commonly held views. We can have something which is about our internal passion, our need for something, to do something, our yearning for something, okay? And the second is the call from an outside perspective, the call from something independent and something larger than yourself. And she just doesn't believe that that's enough. We need to find out what extra we can add to these two categories, these two commonly held beliefs, to live a meaningful life, by exploring first this one, which is the idea of living a fulfilling life by following your passions. So take a note. So when we live a life which is based on finding and fulfilling your passion, we're going to call that the fulfillment view. And it's basically defined like this, okay? The fulfillment view is that the fulfillment view believes that you find meaning in life by searching and finding your passion. And she believes that this is a really appealing view because most people have really positive feelings towards their passions. And it's actually a really important way of thinking about living a fulfilling life. And it has something to do with the way that we think about meaning, for sure. Not all of it, but it is a component about thinking about meaning. So take a note. Now she then says, look, it's easy to see how this view became associated with living a meaningful life, because feelings of fulfillment, right, they're not always opposites. So let me put it this way, okay? Feelings of fulfillment are not different from or not opposite from pleasure. That would be a better way to look at it. And they're also not synonymous with pleasure. But feelings of fulfillment do kind of give you this feeling of meaning. So she wants to point out that in the conventional sense, It's not, a feeling of fulfillment isn't a non-pleasurable thing. It's something we would want to pursue, but it's also not directly synonymous with pleasure, okay? Pleasure is not guaranteed in the conventional sense. That's what she wants to say. Pleasure, when you experience feelings of fulfillment, is not guaranteed in the conventional sense. Can you take a note, please? And this is because feelings of fulfillment also involve being exposed to vulnerability. Now, you probably are going to have a pleasurable experience if you manage to achieve a goal or you manage to have a fulfilling life. You get a contented pleasure. But what she's saying is, in the conventional sense, where you get this immediate hedonistic pleasure, that doesn't happen, because in order to have a feeling of fulfillment, you need to expose yourself. You need to put yourself in a vulnerable position, which can open you up to feelings of stress, of pain, and of disappointment. Take a note. So, for example, if you want to become the world's greatest violin player, you have to practice at the violin. You're not going to be great straight away. And when you go through this, the gradual process of improving the way that you play the violin will mean that you'll come across your limits, which will be disappointing, frustrating, and stressful. There'll be negative experiences with that. All right. And also, it'll be very frustrating because you will want to transcend your limits. She also goes on to point something out. She says, look, you also have to acknowledge that when you want to have a fulfilling life, when you want to pursue a passion, which is to become a great violinist, you have to acknowledge that that means there's some kind of trade-off. Like Prometheus here, getting his heart pecked out. He says, look, this is really painful, but hey, it's going to reduce carbon emissions. So we trade off the pain for reducing carbon emissions. Why not? Well, it's the same kind of thing. As I learn to play the violin, I'm sacrificing time that could be spent on other things, especially things that could be producing other kinds of pleasures, more immediate pleasures, and especially while I suffer, trying to transcend my limits and trying to deal with my frustrations. Take a note. So I could be spending time with other objects, getting more immediate, superficial pleasures, and you know what? I actually have to admit that the process of living a fulfilling life means persisting through, going through suffering and coming across goals and overcoming it, and just moving gradually towards being a better violin player through practice. So the process of fulfillment involves suffering, but persistence through suffering or overcoming suffering, which is very, very much like Nietzsche. But the point is that it's not necessarily about valuing or loving the suffering. It's about just living fulfilling lives, achieving something, right? So take a note. But what she says, and this is quite clever, if we are to endure some kind of suffering as we come across limits, stressful experiences, frustrations, disappointments, and then we overcome them and we feel happy because we've overcome them, then this means that fulfillment in and of itself must have some kind of value that we want to aspire to, that we want to accrue, a value that is different from pleasure. It has to be, this is why it's not synonymous with pleasure, yeah? Because suffering is involved. So if we think it's worth doing subjectively, then we must believe that fulfillment has some kind of value in our lives. It's an important thing to have. Take a note. And so I guess this kind of separates us from thinking about, it's a separate value from pleasure and happiness in a conventional sense, because you could quite easily argue that having a fulfilling life will give you some kind of pleasure and happiness. But I think what we're talking about when we talk about the conventional sense of pleasure and happiness is we're talking about like immediate pleasure. We're talking about, that kind of more Callicles hedonistic type of pleasure versus, of course, the one that you would get from a Socrates point of view, which is about filling the jar and filling it with contented, long-lasting pleasures. But she does say this view of fulfillment is insufficient because its prescription, or the way it prescribes living the best life, it clearly relies on the subjective. It's completely focused on the subjective element of our experiences. Take a note. What she's saying basically that the actual activities and the objects that you engage in, independent of you and your attractiveness, your attractedness to them, is not important. All that matters in the fulfillment view is your subjective feelings towards the object. Take a note. And she says, look, this brings into question people who might do something because they have such a strong yearning and passion for it. But, when society gets together and judges what they're doing, they wouldn't say that the activity has any objective worth. Take a note. For example, she talks about a gentleman who would sit down and make plenty of handwritten copies of War and Peace, and he loves doing it. He just thinks it's the most amazing thing to do. Or a lady who's obsessed with looking after a pet goldfish, and she just thinks it's the most amazing thing ever. And she said, look, these things will bring you joy, but most people would say, despite the fact that they bring you joy, they're not really meaningful activities. So the activity doesn't have the objective worth. Take a note. So then Susan Wolf says, look, we do lie to ourselves. Most people will not tell you, hey, you're writing of Tolstoy, a handwritten copy, without any thinking or engagement of the text. You're just handwriting it out. It's not really meaningful. She says most people would not get in that position to tell someone that the fulfilling view, or the thing that a person subjectively thinks fulfills them, is not really meaningful because they don't really want to upset people. They don't want to criticize people. They're afraid of criticizing people. So I'll just rephrase that. Most people wouldn't tell the person that their activity is not meaningful because they're afraid of criticizing. Okay? Take a note. So to further illustrate this point, Wolf talks about Richard Taylor, another famous philosopher, and his famous thought experiment about Sisyphus, which we talked about when we were looking at Nietzsche. Now, remember Albert Camus? He wrote that story about Sisyphus, who we know, according to Greek legend, wasn't a really nice guy, but his punishment was also pretty horrible as well. Well, what if the gods came along and they played a dirty trick on Sisyphus and they drugged him into thinking that, and they basically deluded him into thinking that, hey, this rolling the ball up the hill is the most fantastic and fulfilling experience you could ever have, right? So the gods have effectively found for Sisyphus his passion, which is rolling the ball up the hill, because they've deluded him into thinking it, okay? But most people would say rolling a ball up and down a hill is not a meaningful activity. You can be deluded into thinking that it is, but it's not. It's just not, right? Objectively, it's not. So it's not a worthy task. And she says, look, this is a really great example as to how we can assess that despite someone's subjective attractiveness to it, the object doesn't actually have the objective attractiveness, okay? So I should say subjective attractedness. We've got a case where we have a subjective attractiveness, but we don't have a case where we have objective worth or objective attractiveness. Take a note. All right, so what have we got here? Well, we've definitely named and defined key terms. We've looked at the fulfillment view. We've really tried to outline what it involves and how it works. We've looked at how people would conceive of the fulfillment view and what they would think about it. And then we tried to compare it with the idea of living a meaningful life, according to Wolf. And what we found was that it's lacking a description of meaningfulness or a description of living a good life, or even, probably to get more philosophical, a description of value, right? That has an objective criteria. It's got definitely hits the nail on the head when it outlines or describes someone's subjective attraction or subjective yearning for the activity or the object. But it's completely incompatible with Wolf's outline because it's not sufficient. It's only met one necessary criteria, but it hasn't got the sufficient criteria. It's missing another one, which is the objective element of the object and whether or not it's worthy. Okay, so that's why it's lacking. It's a lacking view. One can describe a life of fulfillment, but it doesn't really describe how one lives a meaningful life. And the value here that is being achieved through living a fulfilling life is fulfillment. It's not meaning, because meaning requires the subjective component and the objective component. So if you can take some notes, that would be super awesome. I hope this all made sense to you, and move on to the ELQ once I finish this. Thank you.